Good evening, it's Joyful Hermit. Well, I've had exhausting weekend and also some icky stuff, flashbacks and things, and I realized it was triggered by temporal type questions or comments. Um, and my realizing that still many people, most people I think, most Catholics probably, have this external locus of control. They thrive and seem to need uh, humankind, temporal authority, rituals, rules, uh, authority figures who have just come upon stuff that's been made up over the centuries. Not made up willy nilly, but still made up by humankind. Doctrines and dogma and canon laws and all that, and some of it's fine. We wouldn't need any of it if we actually lived the greatest commandment that Jesus tells us. Love God above all things and love others as God loves us, or as we love ourselves, but as God loves is how we're to love others and ourselves. So, and God, love with purity. And if we did that, we wouldn't even need civil laws. We'd all just be doing what we're supposed to do. Being good, we would be good and not harm others intentionally or unintentionally. So, and there's really very little enforcement of all the canon laws. There is of civil laws, but I was stunned the first few things that I noticed immediately, that were not good going on when I became a Catholic. And my spiritual da said, well, what do you think? Do you think those Swiss guards have any effect? No, they're just decoration. He says there's no Vatican police that goes around enforcing all the laws and the rules and what we're supposed to be doing and not doing. and, and I was like, whoa, then why have all these things if people can, just choose not to do them? But that's how it is. But I went through a period then of being very attached to thinking I had to do everything just right and just so in order to be a real Catholic. So I, even at Mass, to kneel properly and hands together, I'd observe other people or the priests or people who I thought were very devout and or had heard were, the rumor mills of so and so's a very holy person and all that. But it was all external stuff. And yes, they were nice and wonderful and good, but oh my. But no, I found out otherwise about ones that you would hope would have been paragons of holiness. And so, and in fact, even the bishop and the vicar general in charge of priests and things didn't do a lot of stuff about some horrible things. and and so it was just crushing to me. And it was personally later on with my own son, a priest who was stalking him and sexually attracted. It was just disgusting. It was terrible. He had another priest that they'd been in a 30-year relationship. They owned a lake house together. Oh, every week they would go, and their vacations they'd be together there. And on their days off, they planned them together so they could be together. And the diocese knew. And then I reported, though, what he was doing to my son. And, oh, well, we need more than just a smoking gun. And I was a firsthand witness to also this other priest and a voice message he was leaving on the phone. I was over there talking with this priest in his office, and And there it came on the answering machine. And I said, "Don't you want to get that?" Because I heard who it was. It was his lover priest. And and he just stared, and he had this funny little stare. And just sort of shook his head no. And so this other priest was giving his message to his partner. I guess you call him a partner. Wife. I think he was the wife of the husband. They weren't married gay people, but may as well have been. And oh, it was just horrible. And anyway, I won't go into it. I wrote about it in a comment. I got off on that this weekend, just these flashbacks of horrible things, because somebody had commented, "Couldn't you talk to your son in openly about, have an open about why he hates the Catholic Church so much?" Well, I've tried. I did have his sister find out that he hadn't ever been molested or attempt to molest, but he told me things at the time what this priest, and of course he couldn't go. He could no longer go to mass there. We'd already had to leave the one parish because of the one priest who was so awful to me. It's getting down to where he was gonna hit me. Had his hand raised. It was getting to be too much, too tricky. And then this other one that was right across the street, the parish my son went to. He had high school group messengers, they called it, on Sunday mornings. He went to it, and he didn't want to have to be leaving, keep going different places. But no, he had to go to a different parish, and because of this priest who had but the priest was after him. So the world, the temporal Catholic world. But so this weekend I was having these flashbacks and awful stuff, and then somebody else had asked if did I have a bishop? Did I have a spiritual director? And and it just reminded me again of just how temporally focused many Catholics are on temporal stuff. Well, yes, Protestants and Catholics alike have bishops. We all have a bishop. Yes, of course I have a bishop. I live in a diocese. There's a bishop here. There's a bishop in every diocese. So we all have bishops. Even if I were Protestant, I would have a bishop. I would live in an area where there's a Catholic bishop. So, it's like, but I think maybe the question was asked, people try to check me out. Am I legitimate? Am I valid? In the eyes of the temporal Catholic view of these things that are made up or people cling to, even. It has to be a certain way, or how it used to be done, or something. And I'm just not into the temporal world, the temporal church. I have seen too much of it. And I have seen people get so attached to temporal aspects of the Catholic Church that they're not spiritually progressing per se. We don't get to heaven based on the temporal. It's our spiritual lives. It's our souls. That's what I'm trying to get people to understand. These other things aren't going to save us. Jesus does. And here we are at Holy Week. And consider how what he did. Now, Jesus could have just said a prayer. He could have said a Hail Mary, and we'd all be saved. We'd all have eternal life. Jesus could just have said a simple prayer. A prayer of his time could have said a prayer. The Lord's Prayer, he could have said that, and that would be it. Fine, we're all, but no. Jesus suffered, was whipped, was stripped, was mocked, and he was crucified. So that's part of prayer right there, is not just words, not just verbal prayers. They're good. And it doesn't have to be a Hail Mary, or it can be the Lord's Prayer. That's the one that I would do if I had no other prayers. And if I didn't have a mind that could make up a prayer, that I couldn't come up with words to talk with God, to talk over things with God, me to God and God with me, I would use the Lord's Prayer, because that's what Jesus taught was the prayer that covered everything. But there's more than the words. It's intent that goes with. And when we take Jesus as our example, he laid down his life. He didn't just say a few words and figure everyone's okay. He sacrificed. He gave up his life for us. So I guess that was in regard to my son and his. It's one thing that he left the Catholic Church. You know, that's he was an adult, and he had bad things happen at his college. A very bad textbook was used by a bad priest from Notre Dame, a dissident priest, and somehow that book, I wouldn't bother reading it, but the professor, the friar who had this class that was mandatory, used that book as the textbook, Catholicism by Father Richard McBrien. And my son lost his faith, felt that what he had been taught all through and in high school at this wonderful private Catholic high school I sent him to, used up pretty much the rest of my money, in addition to helping my daughters with their college. But yeah, and he got scholarships to go there, and he worked the cafeteria line to help pay every noon, and he worked part-time job in high school, and as my daughters did. So yeah, I put out for my kids, and they did too for themselves. And he had this wonderful education, and he loved Catholicism, and he had wonderful friends from this Catholic high school. But it all blew up at the Catholic university he went to. He got a good career. He had an excellent professor, a Pulitzer Prize winner, who really liked him and gave him a good recommendation, and he got a good job for his career, and yet another, then advanced, and so he's got a dream career for someone from a small town in the Midwest. So it turned out, and thanks to St. Bonaventure University and this Pulitzer Prize winner professor he had in journalism. But here was this friar who used this book. And the other kids maybe didn't lose their faith, or I don't know if they did or not, but my son did. And he also picked up a nasty drinking habit there, which, yes, it's all his choice. It was his choice. But pressure or whatever, and predisposition, it runs in my mom and dad's side. And his dad drinks, I think, pretty much, so had toward the end of the time I knew him, drank a lot, so consistently, nightly. So anyway, it's just how things go. And Yes, of course I talked with him, and I had his sister find out from him if anything more had happened than the things that we witnessed, that he told me about and that I saw and his eldest sister saw. This man had a very strong attraction to my son, junior and senior year of high school, to the point that he had to go elsewhere to Mass. Priest couldn't take his eyes off of him all during Mass, would beeline to him after Mass, wouldn't even go back to shake people's hands, would just rush over to wherever he was sitting. I said, sit near the door so you can run out, because he wanted to hug him, feel him, hug him, probably was fantasizing, who knows. Anyway, the man was probably 50, 53 at the time, 54. And he had his lover for 30 years, ever since seminary, in another diocese. And the one bishop wasn't going to take him, didn't take him. But this other bishop did, took the man and his lover, both the priests. So, but I knew the diocese, I knew the vicar general. They didn't want to do anything about this situation with these two priests, because the one priest, not the one in the little town I lived in, the other one was in the city, and he had a very important parish. And he had the ability to schmooze and to bring in lots of money, lots of donations. They brought in so many donations, they built a big school. They finished building the church building. They built a gymnasium, all these things. And the people were moving to that area of the city, of this large city where the diocese cathedral is in the city. And they felt they couldn't afford to displease this priest who was bringing in money and people. Because if the one, I thought they should have put them at least at opposite ends of the diocese, rather than 22 minutes apart from each other. Make it a little harder for their rendezvous and their dates, which was the thing that was being discussed on the phone call I overheard, the voicemail message. Well, he was on the phone. This priest should have just gone and picked up the phone and spared me hearing it. But he wanted me to hear it, I think, because he knew he had already trashed me in with the soup kitchen. He had already done me in the parish and with all the Catholics in the town because of his homilies. He had 4 homilies. They were sermons about me and lies about me. And then he called this volunteer meeting that he was going to lead of all these volunteers, not even knowing that the bulk of them, or not the bulk, but half of them, were people from the town who had known me when I was Protestant and were so proud of what I had started that it had become a big ecumenical movement because I had heard the bishop talk about ecumenism. He had come to the college in our little town and talked about it. The college was anti-Catholic, but they invited him to come for some symposium or talk about different religions. And that's the first time I saw the bishop. I was just a new Catholic and awe and like, wow, because I'd done all this reading of all these saint books and had all these ideals of how the perfection of Catholicism. Well, it is if we would live it. If we would live it. And that includes the bishops, the priests, the cardinals. Everybody's got to live it. And us peons, us pew people, we've got to live it. And the religious orders need to live it. But just one thing after another. In my first years as a Catholic, all of the ideal was just blown up. I had a dream one night. I told it to my godmother, who was a religious sister, and I trusted her for a good 2 years. until I overheard, or maybe it was 3 years, overheard um, another sister come rush in all excited. They were trying to indoctrinate some girls who had visited the convent, just young girls, to have a tour. The convent was dying out. I didn't know why. I found out, though, they'd lost their charism. Instead of their charism of going out and building up parishes in poor areas of the United States and out west and with Native Americans and things, and catechizing, teaching catechesis, helping at mission schools and things. Instead, they were going to change the Catholic Church. They wanted to be priests. So they were involved in this big movement. Well, it was a secret movement. It wasn't that big, as I found out, but it was filled with dissident religious sisters and some priests, though, but mostly women. And these women, they hated, they didn't like men, and they didn't like priests. And as I found out then, they were horrible to my spiritual da. He was the chaplain there. I asked him, how can you stand to stay? I'll just leave. It was his retirement years. He could have gone back to his diocese, and he says, no, I'm staying here for the 5 or 6 sisters that aren't in with all this other, who still believe, who still, want to have confession and like my celebrating mass, and but the women would break rules at mass, and as he got older too, they did some terrible things. And I stepped in, even though I was 2,200 miles away then. I called, and I had means of intimidating and said I would get the news media out there. And I would start a GoFundMe for this elderly priest. Well, they had, I shouldn't even get into it. This is terrible. He was freezing. He was cold. And they'd taken all his money, even his stipend. He had no money to get a few Christmas gifts for people who had been kind to him when he was 98 years old, and he was cold. So imagine. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable, but it happens. We are human beings, and we are sinners. We are sinners. And not all of the women, but I think finally the last died out. But he said there were about 5. He's kept a tally, my spiritual da did, of who was left. And there were those that were following the faith, and most weren't there. And I found out just a month ago, it got sold off. It's sold. It's nothing to do with anything of the church anymore. That whole beautiful facility and grounds and everything. But that's what happens when we don't stick with what we're to be doing, with what Christ instituted in our faith. And when we get too attached to temporal stuff too, to how things are supposed to be based on how humans decided. Well, we didn't even have pews until the 14th century. And then in the 15th century, they became popular, pews. We can go back in so many topics and recognize that the church has been in a flux for centuries. But the basics of the spiritual life and the scriptures haven't changed. And we're to be focused on God alone, the spiritual life, how to live it through scriptures, and through the great writings of those few in any given country of the world in any century. There's usually not many, maybe a couple or a handful, who actually had union with God, who had lived their lives so focused on God, and they were born also with gifts, spiritual gifts, and that later in their life then they had the gift of miracles even, or different things to help inspire others to live the Christian life, the spiritual life of God. And this doesn't mean well, I've got a spiritual director, so that makes me okay. Or I'm praying this many verbal prayers a day, or I'm getting through the divine office all the different hours of the day, even though I'm doing it so fast that I don't even remember what I've read, but I'm doing it, so that makes me okay. And no, that's not what Jesus didn't have all these things we had to do. Read scripture, see what Jesus asked of us. It's a love relationship with God. It's communication with God. It's relating. It's becoming one with God. Love God and love others as God loves us. And granted, I think I've talked about it before. When a church gets so large, even in a parish, just one church building or something, we do need structure and organization. To just for the functioning of that many human beings together. But how we're going to come to God, to union with God, that's not through temporal means. That's spiritual, that's mystical. Even communion is a mystical event. It's not like, oh, good, I got there in time to line up to receive the host. Oh, if you don't receive it on your tongue, it's not going to work. If you receive it in your hand, because that's what they changed, you are allowed to do in 1963 or whenever they decided that. Maybe it was in 2000 or something, or 1990, I don't know, when they changed that you could receive communion in your hand rather than on the tongue. And you could do either way, but there was a big hue and cry. I remember this when I was first Catholic. People were in an uproar. And some saying, well, if you don't receive on the tongue, it's not valid in their minds. The priests would say, read their statements, that the United States Bishops' Council or something voted, and they decided that we'll do this, and that it is okay, and it's just as good as receiving on the tongue. Because otherwise you have like a Eucharistic minister who would take it out of the ciborium and put it in your hand, or the priest would put it in your hand. Well, our hands, they might be filthy. They might not be. At the Last Supper, how did Jesus give the bread that he consecrated? He said, this is my body. Did he place it himself in their mouths? Or did they tear a piece off? Or there's another thing, some places, where if they used to have a loaf of bread like Jesus had at the Last Supper, that got voted out, and instead are the individual hosts. Now I think it's one of the rites. I forget what they're called. It starts with a B. Oh, my poor head injury. and their priests can marry, but they're part of the Roman Church. It's not the Maronite order or rite. It's another one, starts with a B. And they're priests uh, if they became a priest and weren't married when they became a priest, they can't marry. But if they were already married and had a call to be a priest, decided they wanted to be a priest, then they could be allowed to be a priest because they were already married. They didn't say, well, you've got to divorce. No, of course they wouldn't. But that's part of one of the 22 rites that are in under the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And so, but they have a piece of bread, like a chunk, and they, at least one of the masses I went to, and they dip it in. It's tinctured into the cup, and then the priest puts it on the tongue. There you don't receive in the hand, in their rite. So I found all these different things, and it could literally make you just dizzy or nuts trying to keep up with all of it and what every different one's doing and what's right and what's wrong and what they voted on and what they haven't or what's changed. And they also decided against some, like they changed Ascension Thursday because it's to be 10 days before Pentecost, which means it's on a Thursday if Pentecost was on Sunday in biblical times, which it was. But they changed it to Sunday to celebrate Ascension on Sunday. Well, I just myself honor Thursday for it. But that doesn't mean that I realized why they did it, because it's a holy day. You're supposed to go to Mass on Ascension Thursday. Too many people weren't. They worked all day. They were tired. They didn't come at night. Or they didn't come to the 5 o'clock and the 7 o'clock Masses or whenever, or the early morning Mass. They just stopped going. They ignored these, what was called holy days of obligation, that we were supposed to go. So rather than having people just break the rules and not go to Ascension Thursday Mass, they decided to make Ascension Thursday on a Sunday, where people automatically could go more easily and were used to going, rather than a weekday, especially for working people or families, with the kids in school or what. So that's how a lot of the rules get changed, is out of a point of convenience or to stop an embarrassment from happening. Stop people just saying, no, not going, too bad, too busy on Thursday, no time, too tired, not going to go to Mass on Thursday. Where of course they could. We could all, it's sacrifice, it's selflessness, it's the effort involved. But times are changing, people are changing, our society has changed. And I'm an example. People got angry with me for even that the very first priest, when he had that gambling hall going on the side in a neighboring county and was hiding all these funds. Yes, I approached him about it. That's fraternal correction. You go to the person. And that wasn't a good thing for a church to be sponsoring and then hiding the money from the diocese. He's supposed to report all the money. He kept it for his own benefit, not that he used it himself in that sense, but he gave money to this rising famous young author and speaker because he wanted to go along and travel with them and give the mass and talk and give speeches because he kept wanting to be important. I was such a disappointment to him. I wasn't going to bring him to any importance, but so he used a lot of that money for that, to buy favor with this young Australian author who was a heartthrob. Oh man, the young girls and the women would go to his talks and things, and somebody, I knew someone who worked in his organization. A young woman was enthralled, and she got very disillusioned when she found out he wasn't what he was espousing himself to be. But it didn't stop anything. His books were sold. They were very simple. They were basic and popular because of him. He was popular. He was attractive. He had an accent and he appealed. He was charismatic, very charismatic speaker. And this first priest, he liked going along and traveling around the country and being part of the program. See, so it just, when you get into all the temporal Catholic Church realities, and I wasn't even looking for anything. It was like God, I had maybe 2 weeks or less of honeymoon. And then all this stuff. And it just kept going. And a friend once said, she says, well, stop reading these priest souls. And she says, oh, I realized you can't help it. No, I couldn't. I would beg God, no more assignments, please. But no, there'd be another, and I would be duped. He'd trick me. God would get me to another place. I would just get settled in finally. The devil would be at me trying to keep me from this one time, I had an apartment. Well, the apartment lady, when I was moving to this city then from the hometown, my mother was in the nursing home, and I was trying to be with her every day. I was tired, trying to help her with her death process and not to leave her alone and to make sure she got what she needed because she was bedridden and in lots of pain. Her lungs were like cementing over. She'd never smoked, but got this pulmonary fibrosis, probably from childhood asbestos exposure or something. But it was very painful and frightening for her. So, and I'd promised my dad on his deathbed that we would be with her, and that I would, when I was alone with him, I said, I will promise you, I will make sure that I will personally promise you, Dad, that I will be there for her when her time comes. So, and I honored that. I did that, but I was tired. I found this apartment and made sure, is there any smokers here, animals or whatever? Well, just one nice dog and not smoking at all. Well, I get in there and this odor, and I developed a smoker's allergy. I'd never had anything like that. And the doctor says, you've got to get out of there. It's progressive. And I could barely see, my eyes red and watering and hard breathing, and it just getting worse and worse. I was getting in. He says, you're going to be in dangerous territory trying to breathe. This is going to get, progress and get to a point where you'll wake up and you won't be able to get your breath. And so I got out of that apartment. I had to. But I found a condo I could rent. Had a little bit of an odor, not much. I asked the woman, I said, is that smoke? What? It's because I said, I've got this allergy, and that's why I had to move this other place. And what I found out from neighbors at the apartment, a smoker there, plus a big dog that was dying and would just let go urine. So it was awful. And she says, and a nice young gal up above with her little single mom. I thought, that's okay. No, she had a boyfriend. There I was trying to sleep all night, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., right above my bedroom was theirs. Loud sex, thumping the bed, banging the wall, and would go on and on, the screams. And I had to be alert to drive, go to Mass, and then I would drive to the hometown to be with my mother all day. And, she liked to have her back massaged or her chest pounded in the back and the back side, and I'd massage her feet. I had to, and conversation she wanted, or errands run. I had to be able to function. So that was another thing. No, it wasn't just a nice little single mom with her. No, she had to live in. So get into this other condo then. And then I'm hiring these friends of mine, her sons, each time to move all my stuff. And I'd gotten rid of lots of stuff from the house I sold. Got into this condo, and the allergy started in. Boom. Well, she had gone to efforts to try to get the smoke out. She claimed to me, I said, this has had to have had smoker in. Oh, no, no, maybe you had a guest. Just stick with it, air it out, open the windows, and it'll go away, because he wasn't. Neighbor told me, oh, chain smoker lived there. So, and I had to get a lawyer with that one. Fortunately, I knew a lawyer friend, and he wrote, because they thought I didn't mean it, that I would take action. They weren't going to. They were trying to sue me. This lady was, for leaving, and the apartment lady did too. So the letter worked fine for both. That I was deceived under false pretenses. Was I rented when I had the doctor's letter, that I couldn't be any place that had smoker in it. And so then I had no more place to go, and I was worn out. So this other priest, where I'd been going to Mass, I asked him, do you know of anyone who's renting even a room or a house or anything in the area? And he says, let me talk to some people. Well, as it turns out, they'd had some religious order sisters of another convent in the southern part of the state that was sort of dying out. And those two sisters had gone back to the mother house. So the house they lived in, right next to the parish, the church, that was empty. So they rented it to me. But I couldn't, he had to wait till they had their parish council. So I had 10 days, and I just lived out of my car. Well, it's a car my mother had gotten me as part of my pre-inheritance, because I needed a car to drive her around, because my car was so bad that, and by then my son needed it to get back and forth to college. So anyway, I lived out of that car, and this other priest, though, let me stay all night in an all-night chapel, adoration chapel. And so I did that, except one night he forgot to tell the man who locks up. So he made me leave. That was maybe like at 10 o'clock at night he found me in there. And I had to drive to the hometown. Thankfully, I still had a key to a parish there. So I stayed the night in front of the tabernacle of that parish, in that church. I would brush my teeth and spit bathe in the bathroom. And that was just, then I, managed, but had a few clothes in the trunk of the car, and how I lived for 10 days. And I thought about homeless people, and wow, what they go through. I'd have a pillow. I would take a pillow in and a blanket. By then, it was best for me to be on the floor anyway. My back was so painful. And that was back when I didn't have any pain meds either in that state in the Midwest. But that's just part of how I was, God the devil didn't want me in that city. That was why all these obstacles came up for me to even get a place to live in. And as soon as I got into that place, had the kids come again, we got my stuff out of storage again, and into this night. It's a nice house on a very busy street, but it's nice. I mean, very grateful. It's wonderful, very low rent. Was so grateful, and it was that weekend that I was shown supernaturally, and then I went to this other young priest in a different parish that I'd been going to. And for months I'd been going there, even driving from the town, the hometown up there and back. He had very lovely masses, right down to the line of what they're supposed to do. Good sermons based on the gospel. He was very energized. He appealed to the young people. He had all kinds of altar servers. And it was right when I got in to finally the house that I could live in without the allergy. Wasn't deceived anymore. Ideal situation for me. I was shown that this young priest had another side to him that was very, very bad. Very bad. And I confronted him with it, and he readily admitted he loved talking about it. But I also called a priest who he was a good friend with. And I knew that priest. He was the one that helped me with the pilgrimage just the year before. And he said, oh, don't report it, because he's not really acting. Well, yes, it ended up he was acting. So, but he said, don't ever report, don't. And somehow, I suppose, out of confusion, not knowing what, and the diocese, the bishop and this vicar general still thought I was someone else, this awful person, that they'd gotten letters from people in my hometown about this awful woman and all the terrible things I was doing based on the sermons of the priest in the hometown. The second priest, there was a first priest that didn't like me either, but he would never have done sermons about me, that's for sure. He never went that far. He was more going to hit me when other people weren't around kind of person. So, anyway, yeah, just the devil didn't want me there because he knew I was going to get this assignment, and the devil knew I would be on it. So I worked very hard with that priest, trying to get him refocused on his priesthood. And I was naive about his problems to a degree, although he was quite willing and tried as far as prayer life and things. He was intrigued by me, and but then he started using me as a decoy, his fall person, because and he didn't, I would be taken in spirit by locate, and I would be like above and behind him and see what he was doing on the computer, what sites he was, just terrible stuff. And I also then would keep an eye on the altar servers and figured out there was one in particular he was grooming, and my life was keeping tabs, on guard. And I would talk to him about it too, and encourage him to do something himself. But finally then, of course, God let me know when it would be time that I had to report him, and I did. But even how they handled that was Like, you just wonder, what are they thinking? But they don't. See, it's the temporal Catholic world, and even the people who you would hope would be interior locus of control, with God being the one in control of, but they become temporalized. That's the problem when you get into too much temporal Catholic world. And when you let your own minds be run by all the different little rules and um, and I know the person probably sees it differently now when I explain, but was convinced that the masses that I went to, he said, you weren't even at masses because it wasn't the pre-Vatican II Tridentine Mass. No, I wouldn't be having ecstasies at a mass that God didn't think was valid. So I guess that this whole weekend was an upset for me again, of flashbacks of um, how the temporal Catholic world is really nothing to get too tied up into. Seek God, and focus on God alone and on the spiritual life, on the depth. Swim out on into the deep. Swim out into the deep. Do not get entangled in the temporal stuff. Or start with our externalizing things that we think we have to have external and authority of externals and be attached to the externals of worship, of church. Always let God be the one to lead, and listen to God and communicate with God. Learn to communicate and look to these people like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and many others, but not that many really. But they weren't John of the Cross, and Teresa, they led reform away from temporal. It just keeps getting back to more temporalized church. And Teresa woke up to that, Teresa of Avila, and she started a reform and developed an understanding of prayer and wrote about it. And that's how she evolved spiritually, was through prayer, through this deep relationship, love relationship, a real here and now, day and night, spiritual, mystical, grew into mystical relationship with God, with Jesus, and with the Holy Spirit, all three. And yes, and Mary, but the focal point is the Trinity and that relationship with God, with the Trinity, that loving, immediate, obedient relationship with God. So that's, I hope I don't have to, I won't bring it up again. I'm going to try not to bring it up again. But some of the comments and some of the, having a spiritual director is no proof of any validity. Look at them. Look at some of them ones I've had. My spiritual dad, when he found out, even the first one, he says, "What on earth? What were you thinking? What were you thinking?" He says, God expects us to use our, because I thought, well, I'm supposed to obey this priest, this spiritual director. That was the very first one. Supposed to obey. I'd read these books, obey your spiritual director, obey the priest. Other Catholics had said, oh, never say an ill word against a priest. Never talk to them, never confront, never, just always do what they say. No. The spiritual dust said, what are you thinking? Use your head. God gave you a brain. You're supposed to use it, he told me. When I told him some of the stuff I'd been told to do, and how I'd been also verbally abused, and there was even worse. So, but that's when he said too, what Teresa of Avila said. No spiritual director is better than a bad one. Gotta use our heads. This is the temporal world. And there's people in the temporal church from the temporal world. And I'm not talking just about priests. And that can happen in any church. I'm Catholic, so I'm giving this experience. And what it was like to just have my conversion just blown up. My honeymoon period. All my idealism and this dream I'd had. And I looking back, I understand why this godmother reacted the way she did. She was angry at my dream, but it was a vision dream. It was a message from God. It was shortly after I was confirmed, and God did bring me into the Catholic Church. But he brought me in for assignments, and I did what I was to do. And I helped in some ways. I saved definitely one young man from a most awful situation with a priest that was going to take place in a motel room. Priest had it all planned out. He didn't even tell me all this stuff. I had plenty to go with. But it took them, 6 weeks to even remove him. They had to come up with some story that he was depressed, rather than just saying, discreetly, we'd like, or send out a letter to all of at least the altar server parents, boys, or all the boys, junior and senior high, because he had a predisposition for the prepubescent boys even. Please talk with your sons. If there's been any impropriety, let us know. But no, they just brushed it off that he was depressed. And this was after Boston. So, and I found out about 4 years later, as it was, that they hadn't even gone to the police with it. And they should have. The bishop that's there now always goes to the police immediately. It's something like that. And with computers involved, they would turn over the computers to the police. Anyway, but this is my spiritual da, who had been a priest for years and years and years. Even then, he knew. And it's not like it's everywhere, but from my experience, though, there's really only 2 priests that I've encountered that I could trust. In that diocese, I felt I could. I know I'm sure there were others. I just didn't know them that well. But got to use your head. It's not only just the world out there, but there is a temporal Catholic world. And then there's a spiritual Catholic world. We call it a mystical Catholic world. And the mystical Catholic world is the one that we want to be in. that we're focused on. Yes, we go through the temporal Catholic world events and go along with what over the centuries has been decided to do for masses and for sit on the pews that were by the 15th century popular. It started in the 4th. Yes, that's what we do now. If we were back in the 12th or 13th century, we'd stand. If we were further back, we would recline on the ground probably, or they sat on the ground or on a hill or something. So, lest we get all over temporalized and all entangled in the temporal entangling nets, they're just beneath the surface of the water. That's where we get tangled up. We're not even into any deep spiritual anything. If we immediately get tangled up in, whether you should receive on the tongue or in your hand, or like the priest who couldn't cope because I was in ecstasy and I couldn't stand during the reading of the gospel. Somehow he decided that was proof that it wasn't really an ecstasy from God. They had decided it wasn't of the devil because they knew me and knew I wasn't demonically oppressed or possessed. At the time, the bishop was my spiritual director. I had asked them to get me exercise because I was worried. I didn't know what was going on until I read this book that explained everything to me. Mystical Phenomenon by Albert Farge, Monsignor Albert Farge, 1926, translated from the French to English. Used book, maybe you could find it. It explains all these different mystical phenomenon very well. And and I was shown in a vision that book, so that's why I read it. That was an immediate obedience on my part. Finally, some things I did too, and others I didn't. But yeah, I get tangled up in these rules and stuff of, well, when did they start standing during the gospel reading? I don't know, maybe 1930s. See, even the vicar general, the rector of the cathedral, he was using that when he didn't stop to think of the timelessness. God is outside of time. So for God, it didn't matter, the standing at the gospel or not. When Jesus celebrated the Last Supper, did they all stand when Jesus gave his talk, his sacerdotal prayers? No, they were all reclined, partially laying on the ground and with the low table, as was custom of the day. So, yeah, we just can't, well, you can. Go ahead. Get caught up in the temporal, if that's what you want to do. But it's not going to lead you to union with God. And that's why Catherine of Siena, within weeks of my being Catholic, appeared and sat catty-cornered across the table where I was playing solitaire. This was a vision, or a dream. Maybe it was a dream or a vision. They get mixed. But anyway, and very carefully trying to win and get all the cards set in the 4 piles for the different card types, the ace, the spade, the spade, the diamond, the club, the heart, and every card I would put so carefully, thinking that would help me win at solitaire. And Catherine of Siena was catty-cornered over there, and she just smiled at me. And then she said, "There is no formula. It's not a formula." And I got it. I understood. I was fastidiously trying to do everything, learn all these prayers, all these devotions, hold the rosary beads right, all this external, as if that was going to bring me to God, enrich my spiritual life, fulfill God's will for me, which is union with Him and closeness and a love relationship, and to uplift His church. Well, my assignments had me uplifting the church by pointing out some things that were terrible and trying to avert some major disasters for human beings and offenses against God. So, and even now, some of you may be offended. Oh, you're never to say it. It's truth. I'm just saying truth. My experience, I have so many more examples. It was just nonstop. And assignment after assignment after assignment. And, no, they didn't like it. And then people didn't, a lot of parishioners it shook their world. I started this program, Partners in Prayer. They would complain to the priest that they'd been asked if they would like to participate. And they didn't want their externals shaken from them. That they go and sit. They don't have to do anything. They get communion. And they go out to breakfast afterwards at Bob Evans in the morning, weekday masses. And as long as they had communion, they're saved. They're fine. There's nothing more. There was nothing more for them. So no, they weren't going to participate and have a child as a prayer partner and pray for the child's intention. Just the first thing was well, the Lord suggested that to me. All of us old folk, well, I wasn't old then, but we were in the back and all these children every day, and it was like two worlds, two temporal worlds going on. And the beautiful Mass, the glory of the Mass there. And we were just like zombies sitting there, except when we'd get up and robotically go get communion. But, and then off to breakfast, and there wasn't any connection with anything to Mass or the Scripture or going out into the world, being sent out. No conversions of anyone in mind. Weren't even going to pray. Not going to pray for a child for their intention. But some people did, and we had miracles. And that was a lovely thing. But then there were the complainers because and one of the first things that I was asked to do, well, they knew I had this doctorate in the priest, the main priest did when he was at first, really enamored and excited and you're a mystic and, and blah, blah, and all excited about the potential externals of that. But, so I was put in charge to help. One of the parishioners wanted to get a Habitat for Humanity house and had been chosen. Well, then the church was part of it, to be a sponsor of it. And we were to help with some man hours, to participate, to help get it built, to finish it and everything. So asked me to get people involved. Oh, I got people involved. I got lots of people involved. Good, they were willing then. But But others complained. Who's she to be asking us to do anything? It's like, help the poor. We have this poor family, a woman, and I think the husband was disabled and out of work, and they had maybe 5 children and needed a place to live. And they were getting this little, maybe 1,000 square foot habitat house with 3 little bedrooms, but it was, at least it was going to be theirs. And then we were to have a program, the handing over the keys when it was finished, and it was, I wanted to do my very best and to have beautiful, meaningful, scripture-based ceremony of this passing over the keys. A lot of my Protestant friends were going to be there. This is the first thing they were going to see me involved with as a Catholic. And I thought, well, this could be a good witness for them, to show them that Catholics aren't terrible, that they're not going to hell and all this. And they aren't. I mean, the programs that the Catholic Church has, and they started the education system and all, it's phenomenal. But we still run into the temporal and the temporal-minded people. And at least in the parishes I've been in, it's been different. There's been more who are very interested in spiritual life. Got into New Age with it, though. That's another problem then with that. But so we've got to use our heads. We've got to live the scriptures. That includes fraternal correction, and to follow that pattern that Jesus taught. You first go to the person and lay it out with the person. Explain. Show them the facts. Show them the realities. Use scripture. So I'd done that with the first priest right away with the gambling hall, and even compared it with, I said, let's get a bar on Market Street then. Let's buy a bar, because that's social life. People go in for social drinking. Well, he'd been the alcoholic. Oh, no. I said, well, this gambling is the same. You say it's just social, but these people aren't just social. You're making over $3 million a year off of them. And they're the very same people that are the poor, that need soup because their kids go hungry because they're spending all their money on your bingo, and then you're using that money to travel with this charismatic young author. And so we try. And then a couple of times on other things, I would write to the bishop before they had all the hate mail from me, or maybe it didn't register. That was the same person, I don't know. But they did have this idea of me later then. Sort of an imbecile, quasi-imbecile, crazy person. And they had taken someone from my hometown who looked strange, a little bit strange. She really did. And she had been in an accident, and she was also born with a deformity. But she also was very caught up in the supernatural stuff and got overly excited about that. That's another thing we got to watch against is, people who go off onto that tangent of phenomenon. Well, in a way, it's sort of an entangling net all its own. It's nothing to want. It's nothing to strive for. Don't bother. If it happens and it helps increase your faith, or it humbles you, like my experience has always humbled me very much. The ecstasy became like an affliction for all the trouble it caused me. But I was without pain during that time period, during the ecstasy, which I was grateful for. And the bliss was wonderful. It was the closest to my death experience. So I was very grateful to have that. And what I learned of the Mass was the main thing, to have that union with God during Mass. Mass is the best thing of life. It's like I say, that would be right where I would want to be all the time if I could. But the temporal got in the way. How dare she sleep through, people thought. Or what is she pulling? We're going to kick her. We're going to shove her. We're going to pinch her to the bone. We're going to stick something in her and see if she flinches, or the bishop. We're going to make her stand and try to walk around. And yeah, 2 shoulder surgeries later that I had to pay for. Thank you. I obeyed. I was obedient, because he says if I didn't do it, it would prove that I was just wanting attention and making it happen. So I had to trust God, and God willed that I had 1 shoulder surgery, and the surgeon missed the worst part of it for a year. So I agonized for 2 years and went through 2 surgeries, and the second one was brutal. It was a long recovery, not like my back, but and he still didn't. He still wouldn't read the book that he promised he would. It just, I could go on and on. You get the idea. Stick with the spiritual, please. Focus on God, love of God, prayer. Take advantage of all these books. Yes, some of them are fat. I'll read a paragraph a day. You don't have to rush through. Read, but they teach us. People who had union with God while on earth were given gifts. We can trust them. They've been proven by years. I go back and get the ones that have been dead a long time, because that's one thing the temporal Catholic world will examine them under microscopes that they didn't even have back then. That's a wonderful thing. Of course, I can tell stories of situations where some slipped through who weren't exactly stellar lives, but that happens. Back then, they didn't have the means. So to always check everything with communication such as it was. But God lets it be known. But as far as me and, checking me out, don't bother. I'm just sharing. I'm not making any, well, except for, I guess, if you want to think that it's best to stay in the temporal aspects of church, have that be your focus. And then it can be very upsetting when they change something and it's not what was, and you're convinced that it's no longer real then. If it isn't how it was, you don't realize that it wasn't how it was what you liked 50 years before that or 200 years before that. So that's where you get with focusing on temporal. It's not stable. It's always changing. It's always shifting, because humans have access to the temporal. Humans change the temporal. They twist. Humans like power, prestige, position, possessions, and privileges. I have 5 P's now, and it's true. So if they're weak to those, and we all can be, all of us can be, and it's just human nature. We fight our human nature all the time, but stick with the spiritual Catholic Church and help one person by one person by one person. We can build it up. every now and then there'll be a priest or a bishop who will try, and they'll write some wonderful books, or they'll have a following in their area, or they get a reputation for being tried and true. But even they can get off then, way off into politics or something. Yes, politics affects our lives, but the focus then leaves God and becomes that for them. And we have to keep the focus on God, and then God will have the righteousness comes from God. Um, then the temporal stuff, when it changes, it won't even cause us to think twice. It's like, it's okay. Because our hearts, our minds, our souls, our bodies even, are all geared in God and in His living Word and living that living Word. The other then fades. It doesn't. Either way, it's fine. Do it. Go along with the change. They're not making horrible changes. They always have their reasons. But what gets me, can you imagine spending your life focused on those things, which sadly has become a lot of the lives of the bishops and the cardinals, even some priests as administrators. It's so easy for them to lose the spiritual view. That's why someone like John of the Cross nearly lost his life 2 or 3 times, finally did. His fellow brothers, confreres, the other priests and monks of his religious order, the male Carmelites in Spain at that time, in his area of Spain, they did not like his way. He was reforming it by being himself. And himself was focused on God and on the mystical, on the spiritual church. And that's why he had all these gifts and was able to write that and miraculously escape when they imprisoned him for 9 months and beat him and nearly starved him to death. He nearly died then. But then his superior finished him off by sending him to a very bad area, climate-wise, when he was already very ill. And did apologize, I think, the day before he died. Asked forgiveness. But he couldn't tolerate, these guys, they couldn't tolerate this holy guy, this holy priest, who was living the life that we all should be living. I think of maybe any book, his would be the one, The Collected Works of John. You can get it on Kindle. Ave Crux just mentioned that. Cruce, I think it's pronounced. I mentioned that. And then I have the hardback Kieran Kavanagh. Get that translator, that editor, Kieran Kavanagh. He's a priest. I think he's Cistercian. Oh, no, I think he would be Carmelite. Anyway, I'll stop on this. This really got me over the weekend, though. It got me so much, I thought, is it even worth keeping on with these videos? But then somebody wrote and said, no, we like you to discuss others, so I will. I need to, for me, I need to read and discuss what's going to propel my soul out into the deep, swimming out into the deep. And it's, think of the power if all of us would come to union with God to some degree on earth. What an uplift to the Catholic Church it would be. And if we shared, this is how you get there, is by your love relationship with God and living the living Word learning to pray and practicing prayer, effort. And we are doing as Jesus, we're sacrificing ourselves. That's what he's going to do commemoratively on Friday. We're going to think of his death, his being crucified, because that's what it took for our salvation. So it takes more, or it can take more. We have to prepare to give more, to give our whole selves. And that's where I come back to my own son and now how I had dropped the ball. And God's giving me the Holy Spirit, giving me some ideas on very positive things I can do that is going to be in part a sacrifice on my part, an effort, with the intention being the prayer, the intention of love of him and concern for his soul and his return to God. I'm not concerned about what church he returns to. It's just the return to God at this point. He has turned from God in a big way. So, and talk is cheap, as is said. Jesus put more than talk behind his sacrifice, didn't he? And I'm going to have to myself put more than talk behind. And more than talk is also prayer. It's relational. So Jesus' dying on the cross is a form of prayer, begging God to save, to give us eternal salvation, to forgive our sins. Talk to you later. God bless you all.